Hello, my name is Sharon, and the DACU people have asked me to show you a little bit about how to make bread. I should say, I've been making bread since I was first married, so that's been 50 years now, so a long time. Let me show you my ingredients. For this recipe, it's going to be really super simple, just flour, salt, water, and yeast. The water is a flavor ingredient, so pay attention to it, make sure it tastes good. If you live in the part of town where your water doesn't taste good, you might want to try bottled water. Just not, make sure it's ordinary bottled water. And let's go. I think we're ready to go. I should maybe show you a big bowl to mix it with, a spoon. We'll just use a handle, but a big spoon, I'll show you that in a minute. We're going to need some measurements, things. I use 1.5 cups. This is the flour, and then this is what we'll bake it in, some kind of cast iron pot. And I'll talk to you, if you don't have a cast iron pot, I'll talk to you about some using a mold. It's really quite simple, just changes the things a little bit. And I like to use parchment paper, and I'll show you how that works as well. Alright, so easy to start. We'll put in, I should tell you, this is 16 ounces of water. And we'll put in a little bit of yeast. Officially it's a teaspoon and a quarter. 1 teaspoon and a quarter, but I think just a heaping teaspoon does the trick. You can use less if you want to use it for a little bit longer time. Let it sit for a little bit longer. But this works well and doesn't take quite as long. Keep it in the refrigerator when you're not using it. It's good in this jar for about 3 months or so. So now we're going to put in a little bit of salt. I'm going to make up just 1 loaf, so we'll use about a little less than a teaspoon of salt. And now the flour. 3.5 cups. Level them off and get them so that you know how much you're putting in. Here's a half. One. 2. And 3. You probably noticed I'm using all-purpose flour instead of bread flour, but that's just because of COVID-19. If I could, I'd be using bread flour, but I can't find it in town, so using all-purpose, it doesn't have as much gluten, and you'll need to take a little more time making the gluten form in your bread so that your bread will rise nicely. And then all we need to do is just mix them together. I'm using the handle because it's easier to stir with, and you know, bread can get a little sticky. And it's just easier to clean up when it's just on the handle. So just give it a good stir. Are you ready? So here we go, and we're just stirring it around till we get it all blended together. Trying to keep the edges of my bowl clean, if I can. Now I'll just tumble it a bit to mix in. Make sure all the wet part and the dry part kind of gets evenly spread around and mixed together. That's pretty good. The advantage of using bread flour is that this works much more quickly, as forms itself into a ball much more quickly. Alright, now I'm just going to let it sit. A couple of tools that can be proved useful. Like I'm trying just to scrape down the edge a little bit with this spatula. You can just mix your bread with the spatula if you want to. Whatever works for you. Bread's very forgiving stuff. That wasn't much work, huh? We're going to do the kneading in a little bit different way. I'm sure you must be wondering about that, but we'll do it in a little bit different way. First we're going to let the bread hydrate, which means get the flour all on its own. It's going to soak thoroughly, wet itself, and activate the gluten without me doing much of anything. I'll have to do a little stretching, so I'm going to come back every half hour or so and do a little stretching for probably 3, possibly 4 times. We'll see how it works. And now it really matters where you put the bread. Now you want to put it in a warm place. If you want it to take, 6 to 8 hours to rise, just leave it on the sideboard here, and you can, go to work or do other things that you need to do and come back, and when the bread's risen you can deal with it. It needs to at least double. But I like to put it in a warm place so that it'll activate and much quicker. And it'll get going in about 2.5 hours. I'll be ready to form it. So what I'm going to do is put it in my oven and turn on the oven light. And that works really well for me. Some people have a stove with a bread rising setting, which is nice. It'll heat it up to about 80 degrees. My oven gets a little too hot with the light bulb, so in a little while I'll have to open the door to cool it down a little bit. Alright, let's come back in half an hour. It's been half an hour. So the bread, you can tell it's risen, quite a bit. It's still a very ragged ball. So I'm going to just try and get the gluten going a little bit more so it'll raise a little higher and capture all those bubbles in the bread itself. And here's how I do it. I'm just going to go along the edge and I'm going to pull and stretch. I'm not trying to deflate the ball. Coming close. And see, I'm grabbing the edge and I'm pulling it and I'm stretching it. See how rough it is, and you can see how the bubbles are? Can you see along the edge here? So you can tell that the gluten strands have been activated somewhat, but I'd like them to be more. So we're going to do this another couple of times and you'll see a difference. I'm just going to go around the edge, pull them and stretch them. I'm stretching them as I go so that they turn out to be, they get a little smoother, a little stretchier, don't break so quickly. And when I've done this, made it into a little ball again, I'm just going to put it back in the oven. Give it another half an hour. And don't forget, you're not trying to deflate it at this point. You want it to continue to rise, but you need to activate the gluten by stretching it a little bit. Pretty easy work. I'm going to cover it up again. And stick it back in my oven. And set the timer for another half hour. And I'll just do that same thing again. I'll show you what it looks like so you can see how it changes in this amount of time. Alright, it's been another half an hour. So let's do a little bit more of the pull and stretch routine. See how much more it's arisen? We'll give it a little bit longer. We're not going to need to wait too much longer before we go to the next stage, but let's stretch it a little bit longer another time. Here we go. Stretch and pull. Same thing. Stretch and pull. Can you see how it's changed a little bit? It's stretchier, it's smoother, goes much further. And we just repeat the same thing, just stretch it out, pull it out, just go around one time is plenty. There we go, back to the oven.
I've got it off.
Okay.
No.
I need to leave it. Back you go. Well, at this point, it has definitely risen enough, and I'm thinking I need to let it sit for a while longer to activate all of the gluten that it has. So what I'm going to do is do my pull and stretch just a little bit more vigorously so that we can make sure it maximizes all of the gluten. And it's basically just the same process. I'm scooping out a bit, just basically touching the outside and pulling and stretching as much as I can. You can see the gluten is not, it should be smooth and able to stretch out quite a bit more. So even though it's risen plenty enough, it's definitely doubled in size, but it is not stretching as much as I'd like. I'm going to go ahead and give it a little bit longer to activate. It will make for a finer crumb. So if you're looking for just big holy loaf, lots of big holes in it, you're probably fine. You could probably go ahead and just form this into a ball and put it in the oven. But I want a little bit more than that, so now we're going to really let it just rest. That's better. It should be stretchier, but again, this is all-purpose flour. So it's going to take a little bit more time to reach to the point I want it to be. But this time we're going to let it sit for an hour. And if you've been adding up these half an hour stretches, we're at an hour and a half now. And we're going to do just one more hour for a total of 2.5 hours. There we go. So I'm going to cover it up and put it back in the oven, or whatever place you're using to be your warm and draft free location for it to rise. Alright, we're going to give it a rest. And it's definitely by now plenty warm in there, so I'm leaving the door open, and I don't want it to get too hot. But this time I'm going to set my timer for a whole hour. And off we go. So it's been 2.5 hours since we started this whole raising process. And here's what it looks like now. Oops, finally stuck to the plastics, darn. But at this point we're going to want to deflate it anyway. I just didn't want to lose all that dough. It's stuck on the plastic. I'll just cut it off. There we go. Now I'm going to shape it and form it into a loaf. And all we need to do, got a little extra flour here. We're just going to deflate it. Simple process. You can see I've got pretty good gluten now. You know, gluten are just something that's part of flour, and it forms strands and sheets inside the wet flour. So it takes a little time, sometimes a little movement to get it to work. But it is the magic ingredient, the thing that makes bread able to trap the bubbles from the yeast and, you know, raise it all and gives us our nice crumb. So I'm just deflating it and stretching at the same time. I want to get rid of the really big bubbles, but I'm not really trying to get rid of all of the bubbles. See, you can pinch those when you find them. And now I'm going to just grab a little more flour, and I've just freshly washed my hands. So before I do this process, let me show you a couple of other tools I'm going to be using. I took this one from Artisan Bread with Steve, which is a YouTube channel. I got the recipe from him too. He really has lots of different breads, being a professional baker. And I'm going to make use of parchment paper too. Although if you don't have parchment paper, or you don't like to use it, you can just spray this. I'm going to use this as my mold to raise my bread in. And so let's get started with our next process. A little flour on the outside. We have to release it from the bowl, see? Because it's kind of stuck to it, and we don't want it to scrape it into a you know, shapeless mass. We're still trying to keep it kind of organized. Those of you who have made bread before know that I'm doing a very wet flour. And it's still rather sticky, which is okay. It makes it rise and gives it a chewy texture, which is a good thing for artisan bread. And we can certainly use a little extra flour, but we don't want to use a lot. Now this part works pretty well, but you have to be quick, otherwise it'll stick to everything.
Okay.
So we're just going to shape it a little bit to make it nice and round, so it'll hopefully hold its shape. Just bring it over. Sorry for not talking to you, but we're going to lift it up, we're going to spread it out a little bit, and we're going to lift it over the top. And make it stick to itself. And that is a process which works very well for making it nice and round and high. It'll flatten out, but we can at least make the attempt. So stretch and attach it to itself. If you're slow, and I'm being very slow, it will stick to you and everything else. But we're gonna work with it. And over it goes. Here's where the amateur part about baking comes in. You watch a real chef do this, and it's a really amazing process. In which they do 2 or 3 flips and over it goes, but that's alright. We'll manage to get something close to what we want. And over it goes. Little creature, it's practically alive. You know that whole bit about, for those of you who have read other recipes, you know they talk about feeling like a baby's bottom, which is right about now. And we're going to let it rise here for half an hour. And I'm going to put it in this pan so that it takes the shape we want. When you don't have the fancy baskets that they use to make French bread and stuff, you just get to where you're using substitutes, and this is a good one. Got the right shape. If you don't have parchment paper, or you don't like to use parchment paper, just use a spray of oil, a non-stick spray. And we'll let that sit for about half an hour while we heat up the oven. Okay? Do this. Alright, here's the bread. It's only been rising about 15 minutes, but it's clearly ready for me to go on to the next step. It's more than doubled in size. So my next step is to preheat this big old cast iron pot. This is the big innovation that they made so that we can make this wonderful artisan bread here at home. What we'll do is bake it inside this pot. Don't have to prepare it in any way, although you could spray it if you wanted to with some non-stick stuff, but you don't need to. And so what I'm going to do is turn the oven on to 475. I'll probably go somewhere between 475 and 500. The reason it has to be so high is so that it can deal with the extra water. I mean, this bread is much softer than usual, and it needs to bake at a higher temperature so that it'll stay chewy and it'll be cooked in a reasonable amount of time. So we'll put if you have a pizza stone, you're used to doing this. You preheat your oven and you preheat your stone at the same time. So we're going to do the same thing with this cast iron pot. We're going to stick it in there and let it heat up while the oven heats up, and then we'll give it an extra 10 minutes or so to make sure that it's actually hot. And we'll be back in a few minutes. It's been about another 15 minutes to get this pan preheated properly. So I'm going to take it out of the oven. And I'm going to take out the lid too. We'll let it heat some more. And this next step is super simple. I'm going to take it out of the frying pan and put it into cast iron pan. And if you don't have parchment paper, all you have to do is just flip it out. You've sprayed it with oil, right? And then just flip it out into there. And it'll be upside down, but it won't matter. So the last step before we bake it is to slash the top so that it rises in a way that we want it to rise, and hopefully forms the shape we want it to do. So this is my sharpest knife at the moment. It's meant to be a fruit paring knife, I think. If you have a razor blade at home, that's really the best thing to use. You're going to want it to cut a little, about ½ an inch deep. And you'll notice I haven't put a lid over this or anything meant to keep it soft. I wanted it to form a skin so that when I cut, it would open up. So I'm doing this because it's going to rise in the oven. And when it rises, I want it to rise in a certain way. I don't want it to just break at the top to break and be tall on one side and short on the other. But that's what it usually does. It still tastes good. Doesn't really matter that much. The parchment paper is interesting stuff. It doesn't burn very much. Don't know why at this temperature you expect paper to just go crispy, but it doesn't. It might get a little black edge on it, but not much. So at this point, the bread is, I'm trying to make sure the lid's on properly. So I need it, there we go. I need it to be solid and keep the water vapor from the bread inside to make sure it's humid and the bread will rise properly. Do what they call beep up in the oven a spring. That's what we'd like. Let's see what we get. This is the fun part. Now, at this temperature, we're going to bake it for 30 minutes. We're going to take the lid off, and we'll bake it for another 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how brown it is when we get the lid off.
Okay.
Been half an hour, so let's take it. I'm going to go ahead and take it all the way out of the oven so you can see it. Take the lid off and set it aside, and that looks pretty good. I'm going to leave it for another 10 minutes, I think, in the oven, and then we'll check and see if it's done. We want it to be good and brown and quite dried out, so it'll have a hollow thump when we check the bottom. So timer 10 minutes. Oops. Play my game. Let's go. Yes, honey. I'm going to tip it out, and we're going to have a look at the bottom. I'm going to tip it out if I can. Ooh, hot. Ouch, ouch, ouch. That's a hot pan. I'm just going to tip it up so I can get to the bottom here. and thump it. Hear that sound? Nice and hollow, and that's what we're looking for. So now, I'm just going to put it on a pan to cool. It's all baked. I like to put it on a rack. Now we're going to cool from the bottom too. And just to show you about the wonders of this parchment paper, off it comes. And we're done. Just have to let it cool and we'll cut it open for you. Alright, looks pretty good, nice and cool now. Still got hollow sound. We'll just cut it in half and let's see what we got. Nice and crackly. There you go. Looks pretty nice to me. Can you see? Thanks for the visit.